turn the recording on. Okay, so now that we are recording, I will say welcome to Talking Data Equity. Talking Data Equity is a free Friday community event that we do most Fridays, but not every single Friday. And I'm Heather Krause, the founder of an organization called We All Count. And We All Count exists solely for the purpose of helping anyone who is working with data or making decisions based on data align that data work with their equity goals. And one of the things that we love to do is bring guest speakers to Talking Data Equity who are working on this exact project. And today we have two amazing guest speakers that some of you referred me to, so thank you very much. These two special guest speakers are working on the ideas of equity in visualizing data. So we have Pieta Blakely, who is coming to us live from Virginia. And we'll put all the links on how to find Pieta underneath the video, but she is a very skilled, experienced, and valuable consultant that helps anyone who is purpose-based figure out how to measure and visualize their impact. Secondly, we have Eli Holder. And Eli, I didn't ask you where you're live from, so he'll tell us where he's live from.
In Raleigh.
Where?
In Raleigh, in North Carolina.
Oh, North Carolina. Fabulous. So East Coast United States, well represented today. And Eli runs I don't know how you pronounce it, 3IAP.
3IAP, that's right.
And it comes from 3 is a pattern. And that is a highly recommended consultancy and website that never fails to have me learn something new. So again, we're going to give you links to all of those locations, but I am now going to not take up any more of our valuable time. I'm going to turn it over to the speakers. One housekeeping thing I'm going to say before I do is, other than Eli and Pieta, we ask that while they're talking, you keep your microphones muted and put any questions and comments you have in the chat, and feel free to ask questions as much as you want in the chat. Then once they're done talking, we're going to leave time for live questions and answers. That's when we'll get to the questions that you've put in the chat. And that's also your chance to unmute yourself and ask a question. All right. So having said that, I will turn it over to Pieta and Eli.
Okay. Thank you
for coming.
Heather. And Heather, will you keep an eye on the chat and interrupt me?
Absolutely. Neither of you have to look at the chat. I'm on the chat.
Thanks. So how this started is, a couple of years ago, I was, daydreaming about data visualizations, as one does. And I was thinking about targeted universalism and thinking, how would I design my data visualizations to support conversations about targeted universalism? And target universalism is an approach I see a lot in education, but it applies anywhere that there are groups of people and there are disparities. It is an approach where you set universally high goals and then create targeted approaches to help each group attain that goal, right? Approaches that are based on the specific strengths and assets of that population. So all of this had come up in the context of working with Boston Public Schools. And so that's why I started with this chart, which is super common, right? This is how are some students doing on some important statewide test. And this is how it's usually presented. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is, exactly how it was presented on the state website. And I thought, like, what would I do that would be better than this? And I saw a couple of problems. One was that there was no goal, right? There was no target. And as a result, the highest line becomes the target, right? And it becomes about gaps from the lower performers to the higher performers, right? So here was my proposal about how to change it. I said, well, first of all, let's not compare groups to each other. Let's put them on their own charts. And And then secondly, we need to have a target, right? So this does a couple of things. One, it decenters whiteness, especially if you put your small multiples in alphabetical order. It literally moves white to the bottom right corner, right? Whereas before, the chart encouraged everybody to be comparing groups to the white group. Now each group is just being compared to the target line, which is high for everybody. And it helps avoid something called deficit thinking, right? Which is where you focus on that gap and you think, why are the African-American students not doing as well as the white students, right? And I think what you have to remember when you're sending any kind of data visualization out into the world is it goes out there without you, and people have to read it through their own lenses and their own history and their own stories. And if you leave an open question like that, why are the Black students not doing as well as the white students? People fill in stories, and those stories are influenced by hundreds of years of deficit-based thinking, of blaming, right, Black and brown students, of stereotyping, right? And that creeps in and gets read even, if your chart is not actively anti-racist, it's probably going to perpetuate some racist thinking. So that's when Eli got in touch with me and raised a really interesting question. He was getting some pushback about this, where people said, like, well, don't we just have to point out the disparity, right? Like if we do this version, we're pointing out the disparity, and that's all we have to do, because everybody knows that that's caused by structural racism, right? And that started a really interesting conversation, because my reaction was, no, everybody doesn't know that, right? So Eli, I'll let you pick it up from there.
Yeah, I mean, so I, like Pieta said, I had a couple of different clients where this came up, and got some surprising pushback on trying to show outcome disparities between different groups in a way that was intended to be a little more equitable. And so a lot of times when I get pushback on things, I become very determined and try to prove it one way or the other. And this led to a pretty giant, now 1.5 year long research path that actually got published, and we've done a fair amount to really try to unpack this and see to see not only like the extent of it, but how does it work? And that's I'll try to walk through some of that stuff right now. Are we good? Can we see that?
Yeah.
All right, great. Okay, so and I'll do just some background on some psychology of data viz too, to get us into the right mindset. But almost every book on data viz will include one of these 3 charts. When people think of good data viz, they think of these because good data viz is supposed to be intellectual and enlightening. But I'm personally much more interested in the non-intellectual ways that the data viz can influence our attitudes and our behaviors. And so, for example, this is a lighthearted example, but these charts on the left are pretty remarkable because they show that some impossibly high percentage of Americans have become exercise crazed over the time period there. These charts are not pretty. they're not remotely true. But they accomplish something of a behavioral holy grail. They get people to go to the gym. And so in a recent study of 64,000 members of 24-hour fitness, people who saw this chart increased their weekly gym attendance by 24%, which is pretty massive for a single chart. And they work not because they're beautifully designed, but because they're psychologically effective. They highlight a social norm that people happen to be pretty sensitive to. And then another chart that is also influential that I've been thinking about a lot since I saw it on Pieta's blog is this one. This one is influential, but maybe not in the way that is intended or that you would expect. But what's also remarkable about this one is that it is well designed by conventional design standards. It's a pretty good chart. It's clean, it's simple, it disaggregates by race, and it highlights the contrast between groups, which is a good storytelling technique for data viz. And these are all good things to aim for if this chart weren't about people, and particularly people from marginalized communities where we already have this baggage kind of built up. And so there are a lot of these conventionally good charts that show social outcome disparities between different racial groups. But instead of rallying support for more equitable outcomes like you might expect, these charts can actually backfire. Again, to their credit, they're conventionally well designed, they're straightforward, they're well intentioned, but the way that they're framed can lead to toxic conclusions about the people being visualized. And so Cindy, Sean, and I just presented a paper on this at this year's Viz conference, and it has some pretty big implications for data viz in general. But the main thing that I'm hoping that we accomplish with this is just getting rid of these toxic charts. There are better ways to do it. And we'll unpack this in more detail, but to kind of get us into the right mindset, we'll start with this question of, can information backfire? Can any information outside of data viz? So what are some examples of information that's accurate and well-intentioned, but still harmful? And so one example that this group may already be familiar with is that there's a common belief among advocacy groups that raising awareness of inequality will somehow magically make it better. And that's generally not the case. There's more to it than that. And so an example of that is a recent study, I think last year, found that the more that white Americans were aware of racial disparities in COVID outcomes, the less willing they were to support public health interventions. And they found that it doesn't just erode support for more equitable outcomes, it actually erodes support for any health interventions for COVID. And because in this case, the awareness of the disparities created something like psychological distance, where when you see that it affects other people, it's their problem, it's not yours. Therefore, you stop caring about the problem. And so this is, as Pete already discussed, deficit thinking is another example of how raising awareness or just information in general can backfire. And so as a reminder, this describes the effect where highlighting outcome disparities leads to essentially victim blaming. When people see that outcomes are different between groups, they assume it's caused by some personal deficiencies of the groups with the worst outcomes. And this stereotyping effect is what Cindy and I showed in our paper, and we'll unpack how this works. And so the first big takeaway is that information can easily backfire, even if it's accurate and well-intentioned. And this is probably the most important message that I can share. Ideally, I'd like to make all of you just a little bit more anxious anytime you're putting new information out into the world, especially if you're not confident in how it's going to be perceived, and especially if it's about people from marginalized communities, because information can backfire in ways that are pretty hard to predict. And so what do we do about that? How do we avoid these backfire effects? I don't think that the world needs more rules about which charts are good or bad. I think the more important thing is that we start to understand how information is perceived in general. And this is a question of psychology as much as it is design. And so I think I've got four things up here, but the first two I think are the most urgent. And so we'll unpack these and show how they play out with perceptions of data viz. And these are our attribution biases, which is how people can be judgy of other people, and charts can have a similar effect. And then two are judgments of under uncertainty, which is how people and charts use heuristics that oversimplify reality and lead us to some faulty conclusions. And so the first thing to unpack are these attribution biases. You may remember these from like intro to psychology. They're called like the fundamental attribution error or correspondence bias. These are concepts from social psychology describing how we form judgments about other people. And this is important because it turns out that even when we're just looking at charts about other people, some of these biases still apply. And this is core to understanding how something like deficit thinking can play out in a chart. And so we'll start here. And so let's take a second to think about this chart on the left. This shows average hourly wages for 4 different groups of restaurant workers. You can see that, for example, Group A earns about $7 an hour more than Group B. But why is that? Why do you think that Group A earns more than Group B?
Maybe a difference in education and the type of work they're doing. So the one that earns more, they make more like qualified work.
Okay.
Maybe it's a different type of restaurant. Maybe Group B is like McDonald's and Group A is like Cactus Club.
Got it. We do one more?
Location.
Mainly because of gender, and it being more male dominated than female dominated or transgender.
All right, so you guys have pretty succinctly covered like the 3 different categories. That was great. And so we that's actually the best that's ever gone. So a lot of people will explain these differences in terms of personal differences or personal attributions about the people within the group. For example, you might say that Group A earns more because they're harder working, or they have better customer service, or they smile more. And these are pretty close to real answers that we saw. But in reality, these differences are probably more reflective of external factors like how nice is the restaurant, how busy is it, is it in a wealthy neighborhood? And so deficit framing for data viz is presenting group outcomes in a way that encourages these personal attributions. It encourages blaming outcomes on the people. And this is essentially a version of correspondence bias from social psychology that happens in charts. And the problem is that these group level personal attributions are essentially stereotypes. If you believe that these outcome differences are caused by differences in personal characteristics, then you implicitly believe a harmful stereotype that people with worse outcomes are somehow worse people. And we'll walk through an example of that in a little bit more detail because it's important. And so we'll go through this step by step. This is the same chart, but we're changing the colors to emphasize a purple Group A versus a blue Group B. And so you might look at a chart like this, and your first read is that average outcomes for purple Group A are better than average outcomes for blue Group B. And that's accurate. That's a fine read. But what a lot of readers will do is they'll go further and explain the differences in terms of these personal attributions. So the takeaway becomes A has better outcomes than B because the people in Group A are somehow better than the people in Group B in some way that would produce these outcomes. And there's obviously nothing in a chart like this supporting a causal conclusion like that. And then the real damage is that if you believe that the outcome differences are because Group A is somehow better than Group B, you implicitly believe that the people in Group B are somehow personally deficient. And that's a harmful stereotype. And so to put that in a broader context, the deficit thinking effect suggests that even though charts like these only show differences in outcomes, they can be misread as evidence for intrinsic differences between groups of people. And so we've walked through this conceptually. It's consistent with something like correspondence bias, but how big of a problem is this out in the wild, out in the real world? And so these are our results from our last 3 experiments where we tested multiple different types of charts showing outcome differences between groups of people, like the ones that we just looked at. And we found that across all the different conditions, 53% of participants agreed with personal attributions like these outcome differences are because Group A works harder than Group B. Again, despite the charts giving no evidence to support a claim like that. And since the charts don't give evidence for a causal conclusion like that, this implies that there's a belief in a harmful stereotype about the people being visualized. And so this also confirms that the deficit thinking effect can be triggered by charts, and it affects a large portion of viewers. And so the next big takeaway is that charts showing differences in outcomes can be misread as evidence for personal differences between people. And this confirms that deficit thinking can be triggered by a neutral chart, neutral in air quotes if you can't see me. All right, and then the next big thing that we want to unpack is perceptions of uncertainty, or actually closer to variability if we're going to be precise. And so the world is messy and complex, but people like to simplify things. We like to see things in black and white, and we oversimplify the world in ways that can sometimes mislead us. And so it turns out that certain charts can have a similar misleading effect that looks a lot like stereotyping. And so to understand that, to understand how a chart might nudge somebody towards stereotyping, let's look at stereotypes in general. And this is we'll walk through a kind of simplified model of this. There's obviously a lot more to it, but just bear with me. So for example, let's consider that people in this purple group are especially high earners. Stereotypes assume that within a group, people are more similar than they really are, and between groups, people are more different than they really are. And so this stereotype implies a distribution like this one on the right, where not only do people in the purple group earn more, their earnings are very similar. And therefore, all purple people earn more than all other people. But in reality, even if average earnings for the purple group are higher than average earnings for everyone else, the distribution will still look something like the chart on the left. you can see that the earnings are widely distributed within groups, and between groups, there's a lot of overlap. And this will generally be true for any kind of social outcome, especially when the groups are based on something as loosely defined as race. And so the next question is, could charts create similar misperceptions? And so we'll walk through another example, this time looking at earnings for 4 different groups. The distributions on the left are close to reality for income differences between something like racial groups. And again, you can see that there's a lot more differences within groups than there are between groups. And so if we take these distributions and plot them as a bar chart of average income for each group, we'd end up with a chart like this one in the middle. But when people see this bar chart, they may not imagine the distribution on the left. They're probably going to imagine something more like this. Without any indication of variability, it's easy for people to assume that it's just not there. And just like with stereotypes, charts like these create a false impression that people within groups are more similar than they really are, and that between groups, people are more different than they really are. On the other hand, if we show the same distribution as something like a jitter plot or any other chart that shows the range of outcomes within groups, it becomes very apparent that within groups, there's a lot of variation, and between groups, there's a lot of overlap. And this actually parallels real life, where the more exposure you have to people from other groups, the easier it is to see them as individuals and the harder it is to stereotype them. And so to tie this back to the previous section, when we talked about correspondence bias and deficit thinking, we showed how someone could go from seeing differences in outcomes to beliefs about people's personal characteristics. And what we're proposing here is that there's a middle step that facilitates at least part of that, where the chart design can create an impression of an outcome stereotype that leads to a personal stereotype. And so in our research, our basic hunch was that charts that emphasize within group variability, like the jitter plot on the left, helps readers to see that outcomes are very different within groups and overlap heavily between groups. And this should reduce personal attributions or stereotyping. On the other hand, bar charts or any other chart that hides outcome variability would increase stereotyping. And so we tested 6 different chart types showing 4 different topics of disparities, and the chart types varied their emphasis on outcome variability. And we generally confirmed our main hunch. Across the 3 different experiments where we compared high variability and low variability charts, high variability were the jitter plots and the prediction intervals. Low variability was bar charts, dot plots, and confidence intervals. We consistently found that the charts that emphasize variability, shown here in blue, reduce stereotyping, and relative to the charts that hide variability, shown here in orange. And so that brings us to our second big takeaway, which is or third big takeaway. When visualizing social inequality, design choices can reinforce harmful beliefs about the people being visualized, like stereotypes. But the good news is that this gives designers some control in solving for these misperceptions. For example, we can show variability and reduce people's tendencies to stereotypes. And so we have some choice in the matter. And then to wrap things up, these are the takeaways that we covered. 1 is information can backfire. 2 is that showing differences in outcomes can be misread as evidence for differences between people. 3 is that design choices can reinforce harmful beliefs about the people being visualized. And like I said, 3 is actually hopeful because it means that as designers, we have a choice. We can do better. And so I'll leave with one last thought. So it can be very tempting to try to reduce outcomes into simple averages or easy sound bites, like group X earns 50% more than group Y. And as designers and communicators, our instincts push us in this direction. We value simplicity for good reason. But being overly simplistic robs readers of important context. And more importantly, it can make disparities worse by misleading audiences towards harmful stereotypes. And so since social outcomes are messy, especially in the context of big complex issues like inequality or systemic racism, rather than chase this false simplicity on the left, our design should lean into the messy truth. And so these charts on the left are overly simplistic to the point of being misleading. When presenting social outcomes, bar charts, dot plots, confidence intervals, all emphasize between group differences and hide within group variability. And this leads viewers to harmful conclusions about the people being visualized. And so we should do less of these. On the other hand, charts like jitter plots and prediction intervals on the right show within group variability and make it easy to see how much outcomes actually overlap between groups. And this reduces tendencies to blame the differences on the people within the groups and makes it harder to misread charts as evidence for harmful stereotypes. And so when visualizing social outcome disparities, especially involving people from marginalized groups, we want to do fewer charts like these on the left and more charts like these on the right. That's all I got. And thank you to Pieta for getting me down this path at all in the first place. I really appreciate it. And also my co-author Cindy and Ali Torban, who's an amazing science illustrator, helped with a lot of this. That's what I got.
Eli, one of the things that I really like about the jitter plot is that it conveys all of that even to people who don't have a whole lot of training and background in reading charts. I have a whole lot of training and background, and I'm not really sure how things like confidence intervals work. They don't give me a gut feeling.
I literally realized, as I was doing this, I realized that I was completely wrong about how confidence intervals worked my entire life. It's
I still don't know. Every few years I look it up and try to get it again, and I still don't know. This says everything, even to somebody who doesn't necessarily know how to read charts. I think it tells you something about the population size. It tells you something about the spread outness of the data, right? That doesn't require training. And I think that that's an important element.
That's definitely true. So there are a few different studies that show that people our visual system is really good at taking like small individual things called ensemble charts, taking small individual markers and being able to see the trend with them. But what I think makes it concrete for people who aren't who are less maybe chart savvy is that each dot is essentially a person, and that's a very easy thing to kind of wrap your head around. One of the researchers I've talked to about this said that he's tested these on children, and even kids can kind of intuitively get the one dot is a person. Here's how they're kind of like laid out.
Yeah, I think young people are often the best at using charts because they haven't been frightened or shamed or bored out of their interest or in understanding what a confidence interval is, or all of these things. And
it matters in terms of there are also movements in a lot of organizations to have people who are closer to the work, closer to making the decisions, right? And so there is also a DEI responsibility and an ethical responsibility to present data in ways that everyone can fully interact with it.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we have so many questions. So let me remind everyone who's here that this is a community meeting. And so, Zoom continues to send me alerts that it is not possible to have a nice, orderly, constructive meeting with 235 people in it like we have today, but we prove them wrong Friday after Friday. So there are 3 ways to ask a question right now. Way 1 is to put your question into the chat with the drop-down menu set to everyone. And that means everybody who's here will see your question. We'll get to as many of those as possible. If you want to ask a question, but you don't want to have it attached to your name, you can direct message me your question. So in the drop-down panel in the Zoom chat, you can just set it to hosts and panelists or my name, Heather Krause, whichever works for you. And you can type your question in then, and I'll see it. And again, I'll ask it out loud, as many as possible. Finally, if you're in the room live and you want to ask a question, raise your hand. And if you don't know how to raise your hand in Zoom, look for a little smiley face with a plus on its head and push that, and you should see raise your hand. If that doesn't work for you, just put in the chat that you're raising your hand. So, well, great. We have Melody in the room with a raised hand. Go ahead and
Is
unmute
it
yourself.
possible for us to go to the last slide just so that I can write down the email addresses, please? That's my question. Thank you.
Yes, great question. And also let me put into the chat the link. Okay, so in the We All Count Data Equity Community Forum. If you search either Eli or Pieta's name, or if you search Talking Data Equity, we're going to put up the recording here and all of the related resources and attachments. So you'll also be able to get information if you can't write it down from a slide here. No problem. There is Iona. Go ahead.
Hi, hello. Thank you for this presentation. It's amazing. I am just learning about statistics this semester at university, and I get very frustrated sometimes when I didn't see the full picture of something in a graph that the professor showed me. So I started to question more about the context that is not being shown in a graph, and keep having this hard time of understanding what is behind and what is the information that I don't have, that everybody is assuming that are happening, but that is not clear for me, right? So right now, with this presentation, is more clear that that thing that was making me noise on my mind is something that it is important. And thank you for that, for validating that. And then my question is, we always want to use charts basically to inform public decisions, right? So in that sense, we want to show disparities. How to show disparities without continuous stereotyping things that sometimes...
That's why I think it's so important not to compare groups to each other on the same chart. Right. I think the emphasis on disparities really contributes to those stereotypes. And it even does a disservice to the quote unquote higher performing groups, right? I mean, look at the Asian kids who are receiving no support and no resources because everybody thinks, oh, they're okay. When in reality, that's a very diverse group. And there are some kids in that population who need a lot more support. I think the more productive policy conversation to have is, this group is not reaching the target that we have for children in our city. And let's have a specific conversation about the resources and the support that that group needs and the barriers that we can remove and the assets and strengths that that group has to reach the target. I just don't think the direct comparison, the disparity conversation is that useful anymore.
Another option that we sometimes try out, because, you know, we've had a lot of the similar experiences that, you know, we're opening the door to doubling down on stereotypes, is rather than labeling, if you do need to show a difference, rather than labeling the difference based on characteristics of the individuals, label the difference based on the characteristics of the structure or the system that is generating the disparities. Lots of times, if we're, say, looking at student performance, we think, oh, we're evaluating the performance of the students, when actually what we mean to be evaluating in this chart is the performance of the structure, the performance of the system, the performance of the school.
Yeah.
And we have had success labeling, you know, rather than we're doing a thing on health outcomes right now, health outcomes for Black hospital patients and white hospital patients, labeling them the health outcomes for the patients of this hospital who experienced racism and the outcomes for the patients in this hospital who did not experience racism. So that really clearly, if you're going to show differences or gaps, identify the cause of those gaps or the mechanism that sorted those people into the gaps, rather than like leaving the door open to
people filling it in.
That's pretty huge. So the one of the topics that we didn't get into, but I think is important, are these perceptions of causality. So people, we are just like hardwired to see causation where there's not any evidence in a lot of cases, and we take this on like from a very like early age, and so one of the things that we're kind of fighting against is that the causes that people see without other context are kind of nasty, are not fair to people. They're these personal attributions, which are essentially faulty causal conclusions. But what some of the research shows that is if you give people alternative explanations, if you help them see that there are other ways of describing of explaining what you're seeing, the faulty conclusions can fall away. People will take on more of the external attribution explanations, and so showing something like causality, or showing something that lets people that just reminds people that there are other causes for this than the people that you happen to be seeing, and if the data supports just showing it entirely structurally, that's even better. And I think that's it's not an area that we've researched directly yet, but a lot of the kind of surrounding research I think paints a strong story there.
Yeah. Okay, we have a similar question from many, many different people, dozens of people, and I'm going to try and paraphrase it. If I don't paraphrase it correctly, well, one of you who put this into the chat, please raise your hand. But essentially the question is, we love the idea of like the dots being for people, whether it's a honeycomb plot or a jitter plot. What do we do? And this is the case of a lot of people, especially people that work in public health or education, if we have no idea how many people, we don't have access to that kind of raw data. We're just getting aggregate data from 10 different hospitals. Any idea? Have you struggled with that problem yet?
So this question comes up a lot, and it's there's a couple different answers to it. I think the hopeful answer, I guess, or the unrealistically aspirational answer is start asking for more. Start asking for the data to the extent that it can be done in a way that preserves privacy and can be done safely. The more you can show of the real story, the better. But obviously that's not always practical. And so like a step back would be if you may only have like averages for groups, but hopefully you also have standard deviation or variance. And using that to maybe not show the dots directly, but show a model of the dots. So show this is what a distribution of dots would look like given these means and given this variance that was measured. And so that's another way to do it, to show that there is kind of that groups have more in common than they have than that are different. And then there even for there are other things that you can do to if you can start to aggregate some of the aggregates. So for example, if you have data by zip code, then a dot could be a zip code, and you can show the spread across different zip codes. And so I think there are always options, and sometimes it requires a little bit more creativity to kind of get there, but it can be done.
The other side of that question is what about when there's confidentiality?
Yeah.
And so sometimes people don't want to show too much detail in the data because it's it's a very sensitive survey topic or something, which similar thing, you could, use a dot to represent 10 people or just disaggregate on fewer levels. So don't do race and gender at the same time or something like that.
And also, to be clear, it doesn't, the thing that makes this work is not the individual dots. The dots, I think, make it more readable to general audiences. But the thing that the version that we tested that actually did the best in terms of reducing stereotypes was a prediction interval, which is basically just showing like, this is the range of outcomes. Let me see if I have it somewhere. So these in the middle were actually the best at kind of reducing the stereotyping.
Sorry, you're not sharing your screen
anymore.
but you have permission. You can just click share and it'll go up.
Right. So these in the middle are prediction intervals, which is basically the left side of this shows kind of like the bottom 5th percentile. The right side shows like the top 5th percentile. So it essentially just shows the range of outcomes. And this is actually the most effective, more effective than the jitter plots in terms of reducing the personal attributions. And so you don't necessarily need to show the individual people. But I think both options are good depending on kind of the context.
Okay, that's great. And to everyone who's asking, yes, I promise, the recording and the links to these papers are all going to be up at this link. There are some requests, Eli, if you can zoom in on that slide, and I don't know if you can on your machine, but again, we're going to send you all the links to, oh, he can. Fabulous. There we go. So that's the one you're saying had the best performance of people not just habitually stereotyping.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like it wasn't a huge difference with the jitter plots, but it was. So these were not significantly different from the jitter plots, but they the jitter plots did better. I'm sorry, the prediction intervals did slightly better.
All right. Okay. Fabulous. Thanks for zooming in. We have two really practical questions that are coming also from a lot of people. The first is, we have been waiting, and by we, it's almost everyone here who's trying to work on data equity. We have been waiting for people to start publishing stuff that we can use that is different than just kind of the standard 10 rules of what you have to do for data viz, or 10 rules that you're not allowed to do for data viz. Do you have any advice for us who need to build a case to our bosses and our funders about not following the rules?
That was kind of like what inspired this was trying to build that case. Pieta, what do you think?
I think the most compelling reason to not follow the rules is that once you've put ink to paper and sent your chart out in the world, you don't go with it, right? And what seems fine when you're talking in a small group with people you know well, and with people who share an orientation with you, is not fine. Like, you just have to assume that everything you make just goes out in the world, right, without you. And where it's not doing something different, it's going to get read through, and therefore it's going to reinforce negative stereotypes, right? So it's not enough to make visualization. It's just like you have a style guide for how you use language in your organization, right? You use certain words to talk about people, right? Use certain words to talk about race, ethnic, or cultural groups. Well, we also need to align our data visualization with our organizational values, the same way we align our words.
Exactly. And I think one of the question kind of gets to the heart of, our organization has done that. They aligned it with, the 10 commandments of data viz you can find in Twitter or in hundreds of other books. How can we make sure that our style guides can get rewritten based on your things? And these things are great.
I would say that also the question those rules in the first place, a lot of the dogma around data viz rules and what you should or shouldn't do. And the reason that I frame this around psychology concepts instead of like hard and fast rules are a lot of the rules are wrong. And almost all the rules only apply in very narrow situations. And so be skeptical of the rules and figure out kind of the thing that makes sense for your use case and your context.
Yeah, so strongly agree. Anytime that we're making strict rules of this is how it has to be done, not this is what we have to think about as we're creating, is not going to work for equity. Like, full stop. It doesn't matter what country you're in, what group of people you're trying to make meaning for. I think we have probably time for one more question, maybe two, but definitely one. I would think that it may not be possible, or it might be too costly given trade-offs, to create a visualization that address all possible sources of biases. So the question is, should we consider the characteristics of the target group for dissemination? In other words, who we're trying to show the data visualization to? Should we consider the characteristics of who we're trying to show the visualization to when deciding how much time to spend on removing what bias. For example, the general public versus more informed folks, such as researchers. That's not, that the question isn't coming from me, it's coming from the chat.
This is actually one of the early conversations that Pieta and I talked about. Do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I'll start. And then I think I think my answer is going to be no. I think even at those tables where we think we're all singing out of the same hymnal, you know, remember that we've only been doing this for a couple of years, right? Whatever language we're using, whatever habits we're trying to build, it's probably new, right? And we got to keep exercising that muscle and doing it deliberately and obviously, right? And so I think even in small groups, it's important not to forget.
I would say that even those small groups, there are going to be people that aren't on the same page. I don't think it's a safe assumption to assume that people are always on the same page. And so, yeah, maybe a counter example would be like, I think about sometimes when I'm doing analysis, I'll be talking to a client on Slack and I'll send them some really rough stuff and say like, I think this is what the shape of it looks like. And it's like a Slack channel with like 3 people, and that feels relatively safe. And I was like, maybe that's a context, but actually even in those contexts, I've got stuff built up at this point where I'll just show that in the jitter plots at this point, or in whatever we're working with. And so there's not any more friction once you have like a component for it built, or have some templates for it built up. And get into that habit. It helps you get into that habit early, I think.
Yeah, I think those are really good suggestions. Never assume that any group of potential audience members is immune to bias or well-informed. The other thing that we often try to think through is look at a viz or look at a data story that we're trying to tell and consider who has the potential to be most seriously harmed by this information, and address that first. Like whatever we might be accidentally or intentionally putting into this viz. Because I agree, there's dozens and dozens of biases, and probably unless you are in a very, very amazing job, you're not going to have the resources to address each single one of them. So when we're prioritizing which bias to address, that's often what we do, which I don't think is a perfect solution, but is a solution. Well, last question, really practical. People are really asking for this, which is, we don't think we can make jitter plots in Excel. Yes.
Everybody's been asking me that.
Any help for those folks?
I think I figured out
there
one way to do it, but Eli, do you have an
okay.
answer?
I have terrible answers for this. Like I work in Python for this. I work in R, and so like I'm a little biased on this, but I think tools like Tableau definitely have ways of doing jitter plots. And I think there are free or cheap versions of being able to do things in that. There's some other like random tools that will let you get kind of rough versions of it. I could try to find a link and I'll send that to you later. Yeah, I think it is a problem that Excel and Google Sheets and PowerPoint that there's not ways of that they don't have better ways to show variability or uncertainty in general, which would be great if that changes. But yeah, in the meantime, maybe Pieta has some more practical solutions.
I did fiddle around with this, and the best I could do was to use a spacer variable. So I created another number that basically said, where to line this up on my vertical axis, and then I made a dot plot, right?
Yeah. Okay, and yes, people are saying R can do it for sure. R can, if you can use R or D3, you can do almost anything. But they have
Okay, on it.
a steep learning
I gotta
curve
go
if you
learn R
haven't
now.
tried. Yeah, we're very much considering starting an R Academy here in 2023. So
I
you
will
can
sign up
keep,
for that.
you can watch. We'll see. Okay, so in order to avoid you getting absolutely no free time in your lunch break, we are gonna wrap it up here. First thing I'm going to say is this is our final Talking Data Equity for 2022. There's no Talking Data Equity again until, oh goodness, Friday, January, what is that? The 13th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. Yes, 13th. Friday the 13th is when we start up again. And we have some very, very fantastic guests coming. We've responded to lots of your requests. We have a couple of people coming to talk about Asian data collection, especially how to label and categorize anybody who has Asian heritage. We have a couple of different people with different opinions on the. Did
we lose Heather?
Did I? Okay.
Wasn't just me.
I'm back. I don't know what happened. Also, AJ, who was here last time, has agreed to come back. So we will definitely hope to see all of you in January. And I wonder if I still have it in my, this is, people have asked for the direct link for the Talking Data Equity, not just the link to the community. Honestly, I put the direct link in the chat. I haven't tested it. I don't know if the direct link will work if you haven't set up an account. And to set up an account does not cost money. We don't scrape your data. We don't serve you ads. So that's the direct link where this will be up as soon as possible with all of the resources. Last thing, if there is somebody that you'd like to have, or even a topic that you'd like to see covered in our 2023 lineup, there is an anonymous type form you can use to express your desires because we'd love to hear from you. That's it for the housekeeping, and huge thank you to Eli and Pieta. Like the topic and the materials that we have been looking for literally years. So thank you for figuring it out. Thank you for doing the work. Thank you for being willing to come in December, which always seems like a good idea in August. And then when you get to December, think, oh, why am I trying to do? So I really appreciate that you both came and did such a lovely presentation for us. And then for everybody else, all the rest of the couple hundred of you who continue to prove Zoom wrong, that we can have an innovative, creative meeting with this many people. Thank you for sharing your valuable time with us. I say it all the time. This is absolutely the favorite part of my week. Talking Data Equity on Fridays is a thing that keeps me going, and it means the world to us at We All Count that there are so many people who are actually working on putting this into practice, and that want to hang out for an hour a week. It just means the world to us. So we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Pieta. Thank you, Eli. Thank you, everyone else who came. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you on the flip side of 2023.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is great.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.